January 1, 1863. A crowd packs into Boston's Tremont Temple, waiting past midnight for a telegram. When it finally comes, they're not just hearing news, they're hearing the sound of roughly 3 million people legally becoming free, all at once, on paper, in the middle of a war that hadn't even been fought to free them in the first place. Most people think abolition was basically Lincoln's idea. One good president who decided slavery was wrong and ended it. Simple as that. Except Lincoln spent years insisting he had no legal power to touch slavery where it already existed. Except the first country to fully abolish the slave trade wasn't founded by abolitionists at all. It was founded by people who'd escaped slavery themselves, decades before Lincoln was even born. Except one European empire technically banned slavery decades before Britain or the US even got serious about it, only to reinstate it a few years later once the money got too tempting. And except some of the loudest anti-slavery arguments in history came from men who owned slaves while writing them. None of that's a contradiction, though. It's actually one long, messy, centuries-spanning fight, and to get why it took so long and cost so much, you've got to go back to where owning a person stopped being unusual and started being normal. Slavery isn't new. It's older than writing. Ancient Mesopotamia, Egypt, Greece, Rome, empires across Africa and Asia, nearly every early civilization practiced some form of forced servitude, often tied to war captives, debt, or criminal punishment. In Rome alone, historians estimate enslaved people made up somewhere between 1/4 and 1/3 of the population at points during the empire, running everything from households to mines to gladiator schools. Some of these ancient systems allowed for eventual freedom or even citizenship, which historians note made them meaningfully different from what would later develop in the Americas. None of that was seen as a moral crisis by the people running it. It was just how large economies operated for most of human history. But what happened starting in the 1400s was different in scale and design. It actually kicks off earlier than most people think, with Portugal. In the 1440s, Portuguese ships began raiding and trading along the West African coast, bringing captives back to Europe decades before Columbus ever crossed the Atlantic. Spain followed fast once colonies in the Americas needed labor. And by the 1500s, European powers had built a full transatlantic system that treated human beings as permanent, inheritable property, based specifically on race, a legal innovation that made bondage hereditary in a way many earlier slave systems hadn't. It ran for roughly 400 years, moving somewhere around 12.5 million people out of Africa in chains, with historians estimating close to 2 million more dying during the Atlantic crossing itself, a journey survivors and sailors alike called the Middle Passage. Ships were packed so tightly that captives were often chained below deck in spaces barely tall enough to sit up in, for voyages that could stretch 6 to 10 weeks depending on winds and route. The system wasn't limited to the Americas either. Along the East African coast and across the Indian Ocean, a separate and centuries-older slave trade run largely through Arab, Ottoman, and East African networks moved millions more people, a history that gets far less attention in Western documentaries, but that some historians argue lasted even longer than the transatlantic trade before facing serious international pressure to end. The economics were brutal and simple. Sugar, cotton, and tobacco plantations in the Americas needed cheap, controllable labor, and enslaved Africans became that labor. By the 1700s, slavery wasn't seen as a moral problem by most people in power. It was just infrastructure. It funded shipping empires, insurance markets, and entire cities on both sides of the Atlantic. Ports like Liverpool, Bristol, Nantes, and Newport. Rhode Island grew wealthy almost entirely off ships built, financed, or crewed for the trade, and some of the largest banks and insurance companies operating today can trace parts of their early growth back to policies written to cover human beings as cargo. Some of that money even funded surprising places. The British slave ship captain John Newton, who later became an Anglican minister and wrote the hymn Amazing Grace, spent years commanding vessels in the trade before turning against it, which historians still debate as either genuine redemption or a convenient rewrite of his own story. The turning point starts, weirdly enough, with the people slavery was inflicted on. In 1791, enslaved people in the French colony of Saint-Domingue rose up in what became the only successful slave revolt in history to result in an independent nation. Interestingly, revolutionary France had actually abolished slavery in its colonies back in 1794, under pressure from the very uprising happening in Saint-Domingue. But that abolition didn't last. Napoleon Bonaparte, once he took power, reinstated slavery in French colonies in 1802, triggering an even fiercer round of fighting in Saint-Domingue as formerly freed people refused to go back into bondage. By 1804, they defeated Napoleon's army and founded Haiti, the first country ever to permanently ban slavery in its constitution. Slaveholding nations were horrified. Some historians argue Haiti's independence terrified European and American elites so badly it actually slowed down abolition elsewhere, because it proved a slave society could rise up and win. And France, humiliated, spent the next century punishing Haiti economically, demanding a massive independence debt that some economists argue crippled the country's finances for generations afterward. Meanwhile, a different kind of pressure was building in Britain. Former enslaved people like Olaudah Equiano published first-hand accounts of the Middle Passage, describing conditions in vivid, specific detail that shocked readers who'd never had to think hard about where their sugar came from. Evangelical reformers like William Wilberforce spent decades pushing bills through Parliament, losing vote after vote before finally gaining enough support. Formerly enslaved activists like Mary Prince also published first-hand narratives in Britain, becoming one of the first black women to have her story printed and widely read there, adding pressure that white reformers alone hadn't managed to generate. In 1807, Britain banned the slave trade, not slavery itself yet, just the trade, and used its navy to intercept slave ships along the West African coast, freeing tens of thousands of captives at sea over the following decades, though it took until 1833 to abolish slavery in most of the empire. And even then, formerly enslaved people were required to work as unpaid apprentices for years afterward, before gaining full freedom. On top of that, the British government paid slaveholders compensation for their lost property, not the enslaved people for their lost lives. That compensation, by the way, was so enormous that British taxpayers were reportedly still paying it off well into the 21st century, a detail historians point to as proof of how deeply the system had been treated as legitimate property rather than a human rights crisis. In the United States, the contradiction sat right in the founding documents. The Declaration of Independence talked about all men being created equal, while its author, Thomas Jefferson, enslaved over 600 people across his lifetime, including Sally Hemings, with whom historians and genetic evidence now widely agree he fathered several children while she remained enslaved by him. The Constitution counted enslaved people as 3/5 of a person for representation purposes without giving them any rights at all, a compromise that effectively boosted the political power of slaveholding states in Congress and the Electoral College for decades. It also let Congress ban the international slave trade starting in 1808, which the U.S. did. But that didn't end slavery domestically. It just moved the trade inward. A massive domestic slave trade exploded after 1808, with an estimated 1 million enslaved people forcibly relocated from the Upper South to the Deep South over the following decades, sold at auction blocks in cities like New Orleans and Richmond, tearing apart families in what survivors and historians alike often called being sold south. Historians still argue about how deliberate the founders' hypocrisy was versus how normalized slavery had simply become. Some point out that several founders privately called slavery an evil they hoped would eventually disappear, while doing essentially nothing to make that happen themselves. Resistance never stopped, though, and it took more forms than open revolt. Everyday acts like working slowly, breaking tools, feigning illness, or quietly preserving language and traditions from home were forms of resistance too, alongside the more dramatic uprisings that made it into the history books. Enslaved people organized revolts. Nat Turner's uprising in 1831 killed dozens and terrified the South into even harsher slave codes, with new laws restricting black literacy, movement, and gatherings across several states almost overnight. The Underground Railroad, run largely by free black Americans and formerly enslaved people like Harriet Tubman, moved thousands north to freedom, using a loose, secretive network of safe houses and guides that historians estimate helped somewhere between 30,000 and 100,000 people escape bondage. Frederick Douglass. who escaped slavery himself, became one of the most powerful voices in the country, arguing that slavery couldn't be reformed, only ended, and eventually advised Lincoln directly on recruiting black soldiers for the Union Army, alongside him. Formerly enslaved abolitionist Sojourner Truth toured the country giving speeches connecting the fight against slavery to the fight for women's rights, and white abolitionist William Lloyd Garrison published the anti-slavery newspaper The Liberator for over 3 decades, refusing any compromise on immediate, total abolition, even when more moderate reformers accused him of being too extreme to be effective. Political compromise kept trying to paper over the growing divide and kept failing. The Missouri Compromise of 1820 tried to balance the number of free and slave states admitted to the Union. Drawing a line across the map that was supposed to settle the question for good, it didn't. The Compromise of 1850 tried again, pairing California's admission as a free state with a much harsher new Fugitive Slave Act, and that arrangement barely lasted the decade. By the 1850s, the U.S. was splitting apart over it for real. The Fugitive Slave Act forced northern states to return escaped enslaved people, even ones who'd been living free for years, and made helping an escapee a federal crime. The Dred Scott decision in 1857 ruled that black Americans, free or enslaved, couldn't be U.S. citizens and had no standing to sue in federal court. A ruling many historians consider one of the most consequential and widely criticized in the Supreme Court's history. Compromise had run out of road. In 1861, the Civil War broke out, and even then, Lincoln's stated goal at first was preserving the Union, not ending slavery. That changed as the war dragged on. Enslaved people themselves forced the issue, escaping to Union lines by the tens of thousands and refusing to go back. A movement so large that Union commanders started referring to escapees as contraband of war, a legal workaround that let them keep people from being returned to Confederate owners without formally declaring them free. Lincoln, facing military and political pressure, and increasingly convinced emancipation would weaken the Confederacy's labor force and strengthen the Unions, issued the Emancipation Proclamation, effective January 1, 1863. But it only applied to Confederate states not under Union control, meaning it freed people the Union didn't yet govern, and left slavery technically legal in border states that had stayed loyal. It was a wartime measure, not a permanent law, and it also opened the door for roughly 200,000 black soldiers and sailors to formally join the Union military, playing a direct role in winning the war that would ultimately end slavery for good. Permanent abolition needed something stronger, so in December 1865, months after the war ended, the 13th Amendment was ratified, banning slavery and involuntary servitude nationwide, with one heavily debated exception still written into it: allowing forced labor as punishment for a crime. A loophole historians and legal scholars point to as a direct line to convict leasing and mass incarceration later on. The 14th and 15th Amendments followed over the next few years, granting citizenship and, at least on paper, voting rights regardless of race, though enforcement of that second one would end up taking another century of additional struggle to make real in practice. And the punishment loophole in the 13th Amendment didn't stay theoretical for long. During Reconstruction, the federal government set up the Freedmen's Bureau to help formerly enslaved people find work, education, and legal protection. And for a brief window, often called Radical Reconstruction, black Americans voted, held office, and built new lives as free citizens. With over a dozen black congressmen elected to federal office in the years just after the war. But Southern states quickly passed black codes restricting what jobs formerly enslaved people could hold and where they could live. And once federal troops withdrew in 1877, as part of a political deal to resolve a contested presidential election, those codes gave way to full Jim Crow laws that used vague Rancy statutes and that punishment for a crime loophole to funnel black Americans into forced labor through convict leasing, arresting people for minor or invented offenses and then leasing their labor out to plantations, mines, and railroads. Some historians describe the resulting system as slavery by another name, one that persisted in various forms well into the 20th century. Globally, abolition rolled out unevenly for another century, and it rarely happened because governments simply decided it was wrong. Usually it took some mix of economic pressure, international shame, or outright rebellion. Brazil didn't abolish slavery until 1888, the last country in the Americas to do so, and it happened only after decades of resistance from enslaved communities and mounting international pressure made the system too costly to defend politically. Mauritania didn't formally criminalize it until 1981, and even then, enforcement lagged for decades. Reports of hereditary slavery persisting there continued well into the 2000s, despite the law on the books. Saudi Arabia and Yemen didn't abolish slavery until 1962, and Oman followed in 1970. Both well within living memory, modern anti-slavery organizations estimate somewhere around 50 million people today are still trapped in forced labor, forced marriage, and human trafficking worldwide, spanning industries from agriculture to domestic work to manufacturing, meaning abolition as a finished, closed chapter isn't really accurate. It's ongoing. So back to that crowd in Boston, waiting past midnight for a telegram. Some of the people in that room that night had been enslaved themselves not long before. Others had spent decades organizing, writing, and marching for a moment they weren't even sure they'd live to see. What they were celebrating wasn't the end of a fight. It was one hard-won turning point in a fight that had already run for centuries. One that started with Portuguese ships off the coast of West Africa and would keep running long after that night in Boston, through amendments, loopholes, and battles that still aren't fully over today. If you want the next chapter in this series, subscribe for the next Ancient Edict episode, and drop a comment telling us which subject's origin story you want us to dig into next.